Imagine this. 90% of Australia's population lives on only 22% of its territory. It's a huge continent, but it's empty. You might say, well, of course, because 69% of Australia is harsh desert and semi-desert. That's why the population density here is only 4 people per square kilometer. But wait, let's look at Sudan. 2/3 of its territory is also a merciless desert. However, the population density in Sudan is 7 times higher than in Australia. And this is despite the fact that the country is in a state of permanent civil war. So maybe it's all about logistics? Is it too far to fly? Well, first of all, today a flight from a European capital takes less than a day. And secondly, look at neighboring New Guinea. The population density there is almost 5 times higher. So what went wrong with the colonization of Australia? Today we will examine how convicts, gold prospectors, utopian novel enthusiasts, racist dictates, and modern environmentalists influenced this process. The ancestors of modern Aborigines appeared here at least 50,000 years ago. At that time, Australia was part of the ancient continent of Sahel, which connected it with New Guinea. People crossed over here from Southeast Asia via shoals and short sea crossings. At the time of contact with Europeans, the continent was not empty. Hundreds of groups of people lived here, speaking over 200 languages and forming about 600 separate tribes. Interestingly, even then, a modern trend was already evident. Most of the population lived in coastal areas and river valleys. Only 1 in 10 people dared to live deep in the deserts. The Aborigines were skilled hunters and fishermen, but they did not know agriculture and did not domesticate any animals. Their population at that time was estimated at between 300,000 and 1 million people. Who actually discovered Australia for foreigners? There are theories that the Chinese, Arabs, and even the Portuguese sailed here, as evidenced by 15th century maps from the French city of Dieppe. But officially, the Dutch are credited with the discovery. Willem Janszoon's expedition was the first to see the coast of Cape York Peninsula. Then came Hartog and Tasman. But the Dutch were in no hurry to build cities here. For almost 2 centuries, the mainland remained a fragmented, blank spot. James Cook changed everything. He surveyed the east coast and, without hesitation, declared it British property, naming it New South Wales. Soon, the first fleet of 11 ships under the command of Arthur Phillip dropped anchor in Port Jackson. Sydney was founded there. The choice was obvious: a mild climate, natural harbors, and landscapes reminiscent of Europe. This is how Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide came into being. The same contour of Australia was formed: a narrow strip of cities on the coast and a huge, wild interior space, the outback. The British hoped to find lakes or fertile land in the center of the continent. But Scotsman John McDowell Stuart, who was the first to cross the continent from south to north, delivered his verdict. There was no water, and the land was almost unsuitable for farming. Until the mid-19th century, the population of the colonies was negligible. In 1851, only 430,000 people lived there. 80% of them were British, convicts, former prisoners, and their descendants. The number of indigenous inhabitants was declining dramatically due to disease and war. For example, the Tasmanian Aborigines were completely wiped out. But then suddenly there was an explosion. Gold was discovered in the state of Victoria. The small town of Ballarat suddenly became the world center of mining. The gold rush attracted people from all over the planet. In 20 years, Australia's population quadrupled to 1.7 million. But even that wasn't enough. Travel from London cost £20, 3 times more than a ticket to America. The journey took 4 months, and only the opening of the Suez Canal reduced it to 6 weeks. 1901. 6 colonies unite to form a federation. And the first law passed by the new parliament is the Immigration Restriction Act. Why? Firstly, the economy. Trade unions feared the Chinese, who worked harder and for less pay. Second, outright racism. At the time, the prevailing opinion was that racial mixing would lead to the degradation of the nation. Third, fear of the yellow peril from overpopulated Asia. Australians feared the creation of a fifth column within the country. Britain pressured Australia not to pass openly racist laws, since Japan was an ally. So the Australians came up with a clever language test. It was a dictation in a European language chosen by an officer at the border. The year 1901 was a moment of truth for Australia. 6 colonies finally united to form a federation, but the first act of the new parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act. This was not a random decision. It was the culmination of decades of fear. Trade unions, inspired by the ideas of utopian socialism from William Lane's novel Workers' Paradise, demanded protection from cheap labor. They remembered the days of the gold rush, when Chinese miners worked much harder, lived more modestly, and accepted conditions that were unacceptable to white workers. It was obvious to the politicians of the time, in order to raise wages for their own, they had to close the borders to outsiders. However, behind the economics lay a deep, almost paranoid racism. Australian society was dominated by the theory that the white race was civilizational superior, and that any mixing would lead to the biological degradation of the nation. The term yellow peril emerged, the fear of billions of Chinese and Japanese people who could simply flood the continent with their numbers. It was a geopolitical strategy to turn Australia into an impregnable white fortress in the middle of the Asian Ocean. The most interesting thing was the mechanism for enforcing this law. In order not to spoil relations with the British Empire, which had subjects in India and Japan, the Australians introduced the infamous dictation test. It was a truly humiliating test. The applicant had to write 50 words in any European language chosen by an officer. If you were a professor from Shanghai, you could be given a dictation in Swedish. If you were an Italian who was disliked by the government, you could be given one in Estonian. The case of Egon Kisch in 1934 became anecdotal. In order to prevent a left-wing activist from entering, he was given a dictation in Scottish Gaelic. The court later ruled this absurd, noting that the language had to be widely spoken, but the system had been in place for decades, screening out thousands of people and keeping the continent half empty. World War II was a wake-up call for Australia. When Japanese bombs began falling on Darwin and submarines penetrated Sydney Harbor, the myth of safe isolation was shattered. The Australian elite realized with horror that only 7 million people lived on the continent. This was a critical mass, barely enough to defend a single state, let alone an entire continent. It was then that the slogan that would determine the country's fate for the next half-century was born: populate or perish. Immigration Minister Arthur Calwell launched an unprecedented program. With a shortage of British people, Australia opened its doors to other Europeans for the first time in a century. This marked the beginning of the era of 10-pounders, migrants from Britain, and the mass arrival of Italians, Greeks, Dutch, and later refugees from displaced persons camps across Europe, including Ukrainians. More than 2 million people arrived here in the first 20 years after the war. The Bonagilla camp became the center of this process. It was a former military barracks where new arrivals underwent medical examinations and waited to be assigned jobs. The conditions were Spartan: iron discipline, poor food, separated families. Men and women lived in different sections. In 1952 and 1961, real riots broke out in the camp. People demanded decent conditions and the promised work. But despite the protests, it was here that a new nation was forged. The White Australia policy began to fall apart. The Vietnam War and changes in global diplomacy forced the government to finally admit in 1973 that racial barriers were a dead end. Since then, the country has begun to accept people from Asia and Africa. Today, Australia is one of the most multicultural countries in the world, with 1 in 4 residents born overseas. But this transformation was painful. It was accompanied by the prolonged disregard for the rights of indigenous peoples, whose numbers remained low and whose social status remained marginal. So we return to our original question: why is Australia so empty? Today, we see that this is the result of a bizarre combination of natural fate and human decisions. On the one hand, there is the harsh geography. Australia is the driest inhabited continent. Most of its interior is not just sand, but a territory with an extremely unstable climate, where droughts can last for years. On the other hand, we have a legacy of centuries of restrictions. If it weren't for the White Australia policy at the beginning of the 20th century, the country's population today could be 50 or even 60 million people instead of 26 million. But could the ecosystem withstand this? Current discussions in Australian society resemble a conflict between the wallet and the conscience. Business people are demanding more migrants to fill vacancies in mines and the IT sector. Environmentalists, on the other hand, point out that Sydney and Melbourne are already suffocating from overpopulation, housing prices are breaking records, and water reserves are dwindling. Global warming adds new challenges. The very areas that the British once hoped to turn into farms are becoming even hotter. The major forest fires of 2020 showed how vulnerable even coastal populations are. Will modern technology help? Perhaps. Desalination of seawater and solar energy make it possible to build lives where it was previously impossible. But will people want to move en masse to the scorching heart of the continent when the ocean breeze is nearby? Unlikely. Australia remains a great experiment. It is a country that has learned to live on the edge of a precipice, clinging to a narrow strip of fertile land. Its history is a journey from a penal colony and racist dictates to one of the most progressive societies in the world. But the desert in the middle of the continent continues to silently remind us that nature always has the last word.